Welcome to High Scary Stories. Tonight we journey through roads that never end, tunnels that remember your name, and cabins that shouldn't exist, but do. These are 7 true stories from the wilderness, where logic breaks down and time loops back on itself. Out here, some places don't stay where you left them. Some voices don't stop when the body dies, and sometimes when you look into the dark, it looks back and remembers you. This is High Scary Stories. Let's begin. Story 1. The Shelter in Broken Pine Pass. My name is Ryan Mercer, and I wasn't always the kind of guy who ran off into the mountains to hide from the world. But after my divorce finalized in the spring of 2020 and I stepped away from 15 years as an EMT in Denver, I realized the noise in my head had gotten louder than the city itself. It wasn't just the marriage that broke me. It was everything I saw and carried on the job. The overdoses, the wrecks, the nights where I watched people die with my hands still on them. Eventually, I stopped sleeping. Then I stopped talking. I just needed quiet. When the opportunity came to volunteer as a seasonal fire lookout in the Broken Pine Pass region of Colorado, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't much, just an old wooden tower with a busted radio and a propane stove, but it was far away. That's what I wanted. No cell service, no traffic, just pine trees, wind, and the crackle of my own fire. I told myself I'd stay the full season, 3 months, enough time to clear my head. I didn't tell anyone else I was going, not even my sister. I left a note, locked my apartment, and drove until the pavement turned to gravel and then to dust. It was the first time I felt something close to peace. The first week passed quietly. I settled into the rhythm of my days, watching for smoke, jotting weather notes, cooking canned stew, and reading old paperback thrillers that someone had left in a milk crate under the cot. On the 8th morning, after a heavy fog had rolled in overnight, I decided to explore one of the older trails that hadn't been maintained in years. I found it marked in pencil on the back of a folded topo map tucked inside the desk drawer. It was labeled only as Ranger Line 4B, a name I hadn't heard during training. Curiosity tugged at me, so I packed water and followed the faint path downhill through thick brush. About a mile in, the trail opened into a narrow gully. That's when I saw them boots, caked in dried mud and blood. One boot upright, the other on its side, like someone had torn them off in a panic. I crouched beside them. They were modern, heavy-soled work boots, size 11, maybe 12. No sign of the wearer. Just those boots and the faint impression of footsteps that trailed off into the undergrowth. I checked my radio out of habit, but it was dead silent. I remember thinking maybe a hunter got hurt. But deep down, something colder crept in. This didn't feel like an accident. I followed the faint trail beyond the boots, stepping carefully through the thick brush as the trees grew taller and the light dimmed. The forest here felt different, older somehow, and quieter than it should have been. Even the birds had gone silent. After about another half-mile, I came upon a structure I hadn't seen on any official map or satellite overlay. It was a squat concrete shelter, half buried into the hillside with a rusted steel door slightly ajar. The kind of thing built during Cold War paranoia, utility shelter maybe, or emergency storage. But why was it back here, and why wasn't it marked? The air grew colder as I approached. When I pushed the door open, a stale metallic smell hit me, rot, mixed with something like sulfur. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, the only light coming from the doorway behind me. The interior was lined with crumbling cinder block walls and old wooden shelving warped from moisture. And carved into nearly every surface were words, deep gouges etched into the concrete, all in Latin. I recognized a few of them from my Catholic school days. Purgo flagellum corpus ignis. Purge, scourge, body, fire. There were symbols too, spirals with jagged edges, human figures bound in flame circles around X's like eyes watching. At the far end of the room sat a steel cot burned black and twisted, and beside it a melted crucifix embedded into the wall. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and saw the words carved just above the cot in a line that chilled me more than the air ever could. E qui entrata purificatur. Let the one who enters be made pure. Something had happened here. Something they didn't want remembered. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the wall, my breath shallow and the back of my neck damp with sweat. The air in the shelter seemed to shift then, like it had thickened or dropped in pressure. The door behind me creaked softly, and when I turned to look, it was closed. Not slammed, not locked, just gently, deliberately shut. Flashlight flickered. I smacked it once and the beam steadied. That's when I heard it. A sound beneath the floor. At first, it was subtle like distant shuffling. Then it turned into a dull thumping, rhythmic, almost like footsteps, pacing just under the concrete. My gut twisted. There was no basement here. The floor was solid slab. But the pounding grew louder, angrier. Dust shook loose from the ceiling with each hit. I backed toward the door, heart slamming in my chest, but it wouldn't budge. Rusted hinges held it tight. I turned to yell, but something stopped me. The pounding ceased, and for a moment, the shelter fell into a suffocating silence. Then the metal cot scraped across the floor on its own, revealing a crack thin but long-running directly beneath it. From that crack, a pale hand emerged. Flesh shriveled tight over bone. Blackened nails. No sound, just that hand groping the floor, followed by the hollow creak of something pulling itself upward. I stumbled back as a face appeared, gaunt, eyeless jaw hanging slack. It looked human once, but not anymore. Carved into its forehead was the same phrase from the wall, purificator. It began to crawl toward me, dragging the rest of its broken frame through the crack. And then it spoke not aloud, but inside my head. You came to be made clean. I don't remember exactly how I got out. One moment, the thing was pulling itself toward me, bones cracking with every movement, and the next I was clawing at the door with bloodied hands screaming. Something must have given. Maybe rust, maybe panic. But the door opened and I ran. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care about the trail. I barreled through the woods branches, tearing at my face, my pack long forgotten in that cursed shelter. By the time I reached the tower, I collapsed just inside, heaving my throat raw, my mind shaking loose from reality. I called it in the next morning. Told the ranger station I'd found a strange structure, probably a fallout shelter, and that something inside had tried to attack me. They sent 2 officers. Both came back hours later saying they found nothing. No boots, no structure, just dense forest. They asked if I'd been drinking. Said maybe the isolation was getting to me. I quit the job a week later and haven't gone back. But every night since, around the same time, I wake up coughing. Not phlegm, not air, but soot. Black flakes staining my pillow, my hands, my mouth. Like something still inside me, burning slowly. A month after I left Broken Pine Pass, I filed a formal inquiry through a friend who still worked in forestry services. I asked for old site plans, decommissioned maps, anything that might explain the shelter I'd found. He called me back 2 weeks later, his voice low and uneasy. There's no record of any structure within 10 miles of your coordinates, he said. No fallout shelter, no emergency station, nothing. I pressed him, told him exactly where I'd been, what I saw carved into the walls. He went quiet for a long time before finally saying, We did find something weird, though. Apparently, that section of the forest had once been marked as restricted decades ago, sealed off after a lightning strike caused a massive fire that burned for 3 days. But the fire hadn't started from above. It came from underground. They buried it in the paperwork, covered the area with fresh growth, and removed it from maps. The shelter I found, it shouldn't have been there. It shouldn't exist at all. I moved to a small town near the Utah border. After that, bought a cabin far from the woods, far from everything. But some nights, just as I'm drifting off, I hear it again, soft, steady, deliberate, knocking from beneath the floorboards, just like before. Story 2. The Man Who Fed the Trail. My name is Logan Reyes, and for the past 6 years, I've made a living photographing wildlife in remote corners of the country. Not the zoo stuff or backyard birds, real wilderness creatures caught in their own world far from people. In October of last year, I set out for the dense forests of western North Carolina, near the edge of the Nantahala National Forest. I had gotten word from a biologist friend about a rare Appalachian silver fox sighting, a variant so uncommon that only a handful of credible photos existed. That was enough for me. I packed my gear, my camera traps, and enough supplies for 5 days of solo hiking. I wasn't worried. I'd done longer treks before in harsher terrain. The trail I followed was unofficial, one of those unmarked feeder paths that branched off from the main Appalachian Trail. Overgrown and disused, exactly the kind of place a secretive animal might roam. The first day was uneventful, just rustling leaves and shifting light through the trees. But there was something about that forest. I couldn't name, something thick in the air, like it was listening. At first, I thought it was just my excitement or the isolation getting to me. I told myself to focus on the fox. Just find the shot. Get the image. Get out. But the trail had other ideas. By the second day, I had moved deeper into the forest, setting camera traps near a narrow creek where I'd found fresh tracks, definitely fox, possibly silver. The terrain was rough, full of steep ridges and tangled brush, but I kept my bearings using GPS and a physical map. Still, something didn't sit right. Trail markers, small stone cairns, and faded blue paint on trees seemed to shift. I'd pass one, clearly noting it in my mental map, only to see it again 20 minutes later in the wrong direction. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake. Maybe the terrain had looped without me noticing, but it kept happening. Cairns that weren't there before. Markers painted over ones I'd already passed. Once I left a small notch in a birch tree with my pocket knife to confirm. An hour later, I passed it again, same notch, same tree, but from the opposite side. The forest didn't feel vast anymore. It felt deliberate, like it was folding around me. I checked my GPS and compass, but both were acting erratic, the signal blinking in and out. I'd been on enough expeditions to know the signs of being lost. This wasn't that. This was something else. Something was changing the trail behind me. I camped that night in a narrow clearing tucked between 2 ridgelines. I didn't sleep much. The woods felt tighter somehow, pressing in like they were waiting for something. I kept hearing faint rustling in the underbrush footsteps that stopped whenever I shined my flashlight. I told myself it was deer, or maybe a raccoon. But it didn't sound like animals. It sounded like someone pacing, watching. At dawn, I packed quickly and decided to head back toward the main trail. But the forest had other plans. Every path I took curved inward, pulling me back to the same stretch of moss-covered trees. It was late morning when I saw him. An old man, hunched and wiry, standing at the edge of the clearing ahead. He wore a red flannel shirt, heavy canvas pants, and boots caked in mud. His beard was long and white, but his eyes were sharp and cold. "You been feeding it?" he asked, voice low and rough like gravel. I stared at him confused. Feeding what? He smiled without humor, glancing at the trees. "The trail. It eats if you feed it right. But if you don't..." He let the sentence hang and made a slicing motion across his throat. I took a step back, gripping the strap of my camera. "I'm just here for pictures." He laughed once, dry and short. So was the last one. Had a fancy lens too. I asked him who he was, how long he'd been out here. But he only turned and walked into the trees without a word. I called after him, but he didn't look back. When I stepped into the clearing where he'd been standing, there were no footprints. Only a single torn camera strap lying in the dirt. I didn't move for a long time after finding that strap. My first instinct was to get out to climb the ridge and find high ground where I could get a signal. But every direction looked the same now, wall after wall of pine and shadow. So I stayed put until dusk, trying to convince myself I hadn't actually seen the old man. Or that maybe he was just some backwoods local playing games. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted. That night, I didn't make a fire. I tucked myself into my bivvy sack beneath a thicket hidden from sight, every nerve stretched tight. The woods were alive with sound, but not the normal kind. There was movement just beyond the tree line, deliberate and slow. I held my breath. Then came the breathing, low, wet, rasping like someone dragging air through broken lungs. I peered out and saw a shape moving through the darkness. It walked on two legs, but with a lurching animal gait. Its body was thin and long limbs bent wrong at the joints, and its face was a nightmare. No eyes. Just smooth skin where a face should have been, and a mouth that opened wide and sideways. It sniffed the air and turned its head in my direction. My heart stopped. I didn't move. Not a muscle. It crept closer, footsteps silent on the moss. I could hear it breathing now, short, excited bursts like a predator that had caught a scent. Then just as it reached the edge of my cover, it stopped. It tilted its head, let out a low clicking sound, and walked away into the dark. I didn't sleep. I didn't blink. I just waited for it to come back. At first light, I packed my gear with trembling hands and started moving, driven by pure instinct. I didn't care about the fox anymore. I didn't care about photos. I just wanted out. But less than a mile from where I'd camped, I stumbled into a hollow choked with fallen branches and moss. And there it was, a small canvas tent collapsed and rotting, half swallowed by the earth. Near it sat a rusted tin box sealed with a leather strap. Inside I found a journal. The pages were damp but legible, written in shaky, looping script. The name scrawled on the first page was Josiah Harrow, the old man. The entries spanned years, maybe decades. He wrote about the trail like it was alive, how it demanded balance. He spoke of animals left at marked trees, blood offerings poured into the roots. Sometimes he hinted the trail asked for more. People, drifters, campers, the ones who wandered too far off map. One line near the end stopped me cold. I fed it once last fall. The photographer with the red pack. Now it's hungry again. I wore a red pack. I dropped the journal, heart pounding, and realized I was next on the list. I bolted from the hollow journal, forgotten lungs burning as I scrambled uphill toward what I thought was the ridge. But every turn brought me back to the same twisted trees, the same half-rotted stump with the mark carved into its side, a spiral made of teeth. I'd seen it 3 times now from 3 different angles. It wasn't just the forest turning me around. I was in a loop, a circle deliberately closed. And then it hit me. The journal didn't just record offerings. It mapped the cycle. The trail didn't take randomly. It fed in patterns and seasons, and I'd stepped into it at the wrong time, the hungry time. The forest wasn't letting me go because it wasn't finished. Not yet. I wasn't just lost. I was chosen. I've been walking for 3 days now, and the trees haven't changed once. No sun, no trail markers, just the same silence pressing in. But I finally understand. The trail doesn't want the lost anymore. Now it wants something smarter. It wants someone who knows it's real. Story 3, Campground 9. My name is Mark Ellison, and last October I went on a camping trip I'll never forget for all the wrong reasons. There were 4 of us, me, Jared, Denny, and Marcus, friends since elementary school. Life had pulled us in different directions over the years. Careers, marriages, divorces. We hadn't all been together in nearly a decade. But when Jared's father passed away unexpectedly, it brought us back. The funeral was quiet, just family and a few close friends. Afterward, Jared suggested we do something his dad would have wanted. Return to Campground 9. We'd spent nearly every summer there as kids, our families piling into tents by the lake at that same remote site tucked deep in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. No cell service, no other campers. Just woods water and long evenings around the fire. It had been over 20 years, but somehow Jared found the coordinates buried in an old box of his dad's gear. He said it felt right to go back one more time, to honor the memories, to reset. So we packed light just like the old days. No frills, no trailers. Just tents, backpacks, and a cooler full of beer. The drive took nearly 10 hours, but when we pulled off the gravel road and saw the rusted wooden sign still standing, we all smiled. It felt like stepping into a memory. We had no idea what was waiting for us. We followed the trail on foot just like we used to, winding through dense trees and damp leaves until the lake came into view. The water looked the same, still dark and cold, but something felt off. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. When we reached the clearing where Campground 9 used to be, we all stopped short. The site was still there, marked by the crooked wooden post with the faded number nailed to it. But the ground was wrong. It was burned. The fire pit, we remembered, was now a circle of blackened stone surrounded by scorched earth. Charred tree trunks leaned inward like they'd been warped by intense heat, and the soil crunched beneath our boots, brittle and gray. "No way," Marcus muttered, crouching to run his hand through the ash. "It's like nothing's touched this since it burned." Jared stared at the fire ring, his face pale. "I don't remember it ever burning. Do you?" None of us did. We'd spent half our childhood summers here, and not once had we heard about a fire. But there was no mistaking it. Something had scorched this place and left it untouched for decades. And it had waited patiently for us to come back. We tried to brush it off, told ourselves maybe a lightning strike had hit the area long after we'd last been here. Forest fires happen after all. But something about the way everything else around it remained untouched didn't sit right. The rest of the trees were healthy. The grass outside the perimeter grew tall and green. It was only Campground 9 that looked dead. Still, we set up our tents on the outer edge of the site, just far enough to avoid the worst of the ash. That evening, while collecting firewood, Denny wandered a little farther into the trees. He came back pale and quiet, carrying something in his hand. It was a melted plastic boombox, bright red, warped, like it had been in a furnace. On the front, written in faded black Sharpie, was a name. Mine. I hadn't seen that boombox since I was 12. That's not all, Denny said, and led us to a shallow depression near the base of a tree. Half buried in the dirt were 2 small sneakers, the kind with flashing lights in the soles. We all stared at them, unmoving. They looked like Jared's old ones, Marcus whispered. Jared didn't respond. He was staring at the massive pine tree above them, jaw clenched. Carved into the bark in deep black grooves were faces, dozens of them, small, twisted, some smiling, some screaming. The fire had blackened them, but they were still visible, still watching. We didn't speak much after that. We just sat by the fire, not looking at the woods, trying to pretend we hadn't come home to something that remembered us. That night, the fire barely helped. The warmth felt thin, the light weaker than it should have been. None of us said what we were thinking, but the tension hung heavy between us. Jared kept pacing, staring toward the tree line. Denny sat hunched over, eyes locked on the boombox like it might start playing. Marcus didn't even take off his boots before climbing into his tent. I was the only one still pretending to be calm, though I kept my flashlight gripped tight in my lap. Around 2 a.m, I heard it. A voice low, muffled, but unmistakable. "Mark, come here." I froze. Was my voice calling from the woods? "Come here, you have to see this." I zipped open my tent and shined the light toward the trees. Nothing, just fog weaving between trunks. Then I noticed something. Marcus's tent was open, empty. I shook Denny awake. We looked for him calling his name, but the woods only echoed our words back in distorted versions of our own voices. An hour later, Denny disappeared. He'd gone to refill his water by the lake. I heard a splash, then laughter, his laughter followed by silence. By dawn, Jared was gone too. His boots still sat by the fire. His flashlight was on. Now it's just me. Every few minutes I hear them calling. Not their real voices, mine. Laughing, crying, whispering always, from just beyond the trees. They don't sound afraid. They sound like they belong. I don't remember leaving the forest. One moment I was crouched by the dead fire, gripping the boombox like a lifeline, listening to my own voice whisper from the trees. The next, I was stumbling out onto a highway shoulder, barefoot clothes, torn lips, cracked from thirst. A driver pulled over, asked if I was hurt. I couldn't speak, just nodded. At the hospital, they said I'd been missing for 4 days. I only remember 3. When the police questioned me, I tried to explain about the campsite, the fire-blackened trees, the voices. But they looked at me like I was cracked in the head. They found the location based on Jared's GPS tag, but reported nothing unusual. No fire damage, no burned-out trees, just an empty clearing by a lake, untouched. They chalked it up to shock, maybe some kind of trauma response. But every night since, I've woken up with dirt under my fingernails and pine needles in my bed. Something in me never left that place. And I don't think it ever intended to let me go. 2 weeks after I got out of the hospital, a detective came to see me. He said they were still trying to piece together what happened out there, though they weren't hopeful. Then he handed me a photo. Said it turned up in the local ranger archives when they were reviewing old campground records. The picture was faded, water-stained, but clear enough. 4 boys sitting around a fire pit at Campground 9. Laughing, smiling. In the background, the lake shimmered under a summer sun. It was us. Me, Jared, Denny, Marcus. Same faces, same smiles, same scar on my chin from when I fell off a bike when I was 6. Only the photo was dated July 1987. And I wasn't born until 1990. I stared at that photo for hours, tracing the edges of my own face, the way the light hit my eyes, the dirt on my shirt. It was me. It was all of us, smiling like we belonged there. But I wasn't even born until 1991. Story 4. The Screaming Hills of Bitter Root. My name is Owen Briggs. I served 3 tours overseas before I came home and unraveled. Civilian life didn't fit anymore. Crowds made me sweat. Silence made me flinch. Sleep came in broken pieces. My therapist said I needed a new routine, something that grounded me, gave structure without noise. Hiking became that thing. I started walking long trails alone, filming my routes, uploading videos to a small YouTube channel called Briggs Walks. Most of my subscribers are veterans like me or people looking to disconnect from their own chaos. I keep the content simple: trail reviews, survival tips, gear breakdowns. I don't talk much about the war or what it left behind in me. The woods became a place where I didn't have to explain myself. Just the sound of boots on soil wind in the trees and the rhythm of breathing. In early September, I chose a stretch of trail that carved through the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana. It was off the radar, almost untouched, remote enough that the Forest Service didn't even maintain the upper ridges anymore. That's exactly why I went. No people, no traffic, just me and the hills. But out there somewhere past mile marker 9, I heard something that didn't belong. Something that made me think twice about ever walking into the trees again. It started on the second night. I had set up camp along a narrow ridge just above a stream, the kind of place where sound carries forever. The air was still the fire burning low, and I was reviewing footage on my camera when I heard it, distant at first, but sharp enough to make me freeze. "Owen, help me." I looked up, scanning the tree line. The voice had come from somewhere across the stream, maybe 200 yards away. I called out, but there was no response. Just the crackling of the fire and the faint whisper of wind. A few minutes passed, and I tried to shake it off. Maybe an echo, maybe a trick of the valley. But then it came again. "Owen, please." Same tone, same inflection, same voice, my voice. I stood slowly, flashlight in hand, but the woods were empty. No movement, no signs of anyone. Just the sound repeating every few minutes, always the same words, always with my voice. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about combat zones where the enemy would record voices, play them to lure soldiers into traps. But this was Montana. This was supposed to be safe. The next morning I packed up early and decided to push farther up the ridge. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the voice had to be some kind of auditory echo off the canyon walls. But I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something standing just beyond the trees. Around midday, I came across a break in the trail where a rock slide had cleared an old path downhill. It wasn't on any map, but the overgrowth had been trampled recently, like someone had come through not long ago. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed it. The path dropped into a basin choked with pine and mist. At the center there was a clearing, and in that clearing I found them. Helmets, mining helmets. At least half a dozen of them impaled on long wooden stakes driven deep into the ground. Most were rusted and split with age, but 2 of them, bright orange and yellow, were newer. One still had a headlamp flickering dimly in the fog. And then I saw the blood. Fresh, dark smears trailing down the woods, soaking into the moss below. One helmet had a patch on the side, Bitterroot Mining Co. I recognized the name. The company went defunct in the 1970s after an accident killed 13 men in an unregistered shaft. The smell hit next copper rot and something sweet like spoiled fruit. I turned around to leave, but just before I stepped back onto the trail, I heard it again. "Owen, down here." This time it wasn't a whisper. It was inches from my ear. I bolted uphill, stumbling through the brush, heart thundering in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what might be behind me. When I finally reached a ridgeline, I dropped to my knees, gasping for air. I stayed there for a long time, until the forest fell quiet again. That evening, I made camp in a different spot, higher ground, with a clear view of every direction. I built a fire and kept my rifle close. I told myself if anything came near, I'd be ready. It showed up just past midnight. At first, I thought it was a dream. A voice called out from the trees, calm, steady, painfully familiar. "Owen, it's me." I froze. The voice didn't belong here. It belonged to my brother Caleb. Caleb had died in Iraq. I'd watched it happen. I stood slowly, flashlight trembling in my hand, and scanned the woods. And then he stepped into the firelight. Same face, same crooked smile, same scar above his left eye. My mouth went dry. I couldn't move. He walked closer, slow and steady. "You left me behind," he whispered. "No," I said. "You're not real." His face twitched, then twisted lips, pulling back unnaturally, revealing too many teeth, too wide a mouth. His eyes turned hollow, black as ash. He lunged. I fired. The round hit center mass, but the thing didn't fall. It just screamed a shrill, cracking wail that didn't come from any human throat and vanished into the dark. The scream echoed for miles. And worse, it wasn't alone. Other voices answered. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a boulder, rifle in hand, watching the woods tremble in silence. Whatever that thing was, it didn't bleed. Where the bullet hit the skin, split like paper, revealing something beneath that shimmered dark and slick. At dawn, I followed the bloodless trail down the slope, hoping to convince myself it had fled for good. But near the base of a twisted pine, I found a patch of disturbed earth and shallow prints. Too long, wrong shape, and beside them, something worse. My own face drawn crudely into the dirt with a fingertip. Every detail was exact. The scar on my cheek, the crease near my eye. It had remembered, worn me like a mask. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I backed away slowly, trying not to blink. That thing had run, yes, but it wasn't gone. It had taken part of me, memorized it. And the next time it came back, it wouldn't need to pretend to be my brother. It would already know who I was. I made it out 2 days later, dirty, exhausted, and half-starved. I didn't tell anyone what really happened, just that I got lost after a fall and decided to cut the trip short. When I got home, I uploaded my footage like I always do. But something was wrong. The clips from the last week were already edited, already rendered. Titles, timestamps, everything perfect. I hit play. It was my face, my gear, my trails. But the voice wasn't mine. It was close, same tone, same rhythm, but colder, emptier. The eyes on screen didn't blink right. The smile lingered too long. It was like watching a copy that didn't know how to be human. The worst part? Thousands of views, hundreds of comments, all asking for more. I deleted the files, changed my passwords, shut down the channel. But last night, I got a notification. A new video. Same title format, same face, same voice that isn't mine. I didn't film it, I didn't upload it, and it's still posting new content under my name. Story 5. The Cabin That Moves. My name is Eric Dalton, and I work for the Forestry Division out of northern Idaho. Most of my job is routine trail checks, wildlife reports, the occasional call about lost hikers who end up at the wrong lake. But every now and then, something strange hits the docket. Last fall, I was assigned to investigate an illegal structure spotted deep in the backcountry. A drone team surveying old wildfire lines picked it up on thermal imaging a small cabin tucked into the woods where no cabin should have been. No permits, no old registry, nothing on record. The cabin had only appeared in one flight. By the next drone pass a few days later, it was gone. Vanished. No debris, no sign of recent fire or removal. Just empty forest. The coordinates led into a dense stretch of old-growth pine, far from any trailheads, at least 15 miles off-grid. They figured it was some off-the-books hunter's setup or a prepper trying to go unnoticed. They sent me in, alone, gave me a week, and told me to log everything. It sounded simple. Hike in, confirm the structure, report back. But that was before I found it. Before I realized the cabin was still out there. Just not where it had been. And definitely not still. It took me 2 days to reach the coordinates on foot. The terrain was rough, full of narrow gullies and uneven ridges that didn't match the topographic maps I carried. On the morning of the third day, I spotted it tucked between two leaning pines at the edge of a shallow ravine. The cabin looked exactly like the drone image. Small, single-room structure, slanted roof, dark timber walls that seemed too old to be recent construction. No path, no tracks. Just the cabin sitting in the silence, like it had always been there. I radioed in my location, gave coordinates from my GPS unit, and made a note of the time. Then I checked my tracker again, and froze. The unit said I was moving, not by much, maybe 2 or 3 feet every few seconds, but I was standing still, watching the numbers shift. The elevation wobbled too, bouncing between slight drops and sudden rises, like I was riding something that breathed beneath the earth. I stepped away from the cabin. The numbers steadied. I walked back. They started drifting again. I didn't know what bothered me more, the cabin itself, or the idea that something under it might be dragging both of us somewhere I wasn't meant to go. I circled the cabin slowly, hoping to find a window, a weak board, any opening. But there were no windows, and the walls felt oddly warm, almost like the sun had been beating on them for hours, even though I stood under thick tree cover. When I reached the front again, the door had changed. It looked the same handle, same wood, but it felt newer somehow, more intact. I reached out and tugged the handle. It didn't budge. I leaned my shoulder into it. Still nothing. The damn thing was sealed tight. Frustrated, I stepped back and reached for my satellite phone to log the obstruction. That's when I noticed something else. The scent. Pine, sure. Earth decay, all normal. But now, something sweet drifted in like hot sap or fermenting fruit. It clung to my clothes. I turned to leave. And that's when I saw it. Through the trees, another cabin. Same slanted roof, same position, just farther uphill. I blinked. My heart began to race. No, it couldn't be. I spun around. The cabin behind me was gone. Gone. Just forest now. Panic surged through me. I checked my GPS again. The reading had reset new coordinates almost a quarter mile east. I turned toward the new cabin and found myself standing at its door, not walking, just already there. And when I looked down, the door was open, and I was already inside. The interior was darker than it should have been. No windows, no furniture, just bare timber walls and a floor warped from age or something worse. The door behind me creaked shut on its own. I rushed to stop it, but my hands passed right through it like pushing at thick fog. That's when the cabin began to groan. Low at first, like a settling foundation, then louder, layered with cracking wood and a grinding sound that echoed beneath the floor. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and that's when I saw them shadows crawling up the walls. Not cast from anything, not mine. They slithered like liquid, peeling themselves from the corners. Arms, fingers, faces with mouths wide open in a soundless scream. I ran for a corner, but the cabin shifted beneath me. The floor tilted and rolled like I was inside a rotating drum. I fell hard, scraped my arm, and watched as the walls seemed to spin around me faster and faster. There was no exit now. No door. No seams. Only the shadows moving closer, their forms flickering in and out, merging, growing. I shouted for help, but the sound twisted in my throat and came out backward like a tape rewound too far. The cabin groaned again this time, a deep, pulsing thud, then everything went still. I opened my eyes. The door was open again, but it led to a forest I didn't recognize. I don't remember leaving the cabin. The next clear thing was the blinding white of hospital lights and the sharp scent of antiseptic. A nurse was leaning over me, saying I'd been found wandering a dirt road 20 miles from the trailhead, dehydrated, bruised, muttering nonsense about moving walls and shadows with mouths. They said I'd been missing for 4 days. No phone, no pack, no ID. Just the ranger patch still stitched to my shirt and dried blood on my hands that wasn't mine. When they asked what happened, I opened my mouth, but nothing came. Not just fear. A hole. Something was gone. I could picture the cabin, hear the creaking, smell the sweet rot. But everything after the door closed was blank. They brought in a psychiatrist, gave me sedatives, called it trauma or a fugue state. I nodded along, agreed to rest. But every night since I've dreamed of standing at the edge of a clearing. The same slanted roof, the same cabin, always in a different place. And in the dream, I know this, I didn't walk out. It let me go. 2 weeks after I was discharged, I retrieved the GPS unit the search and rescue team had found in my pocket. Somehow, it had survived the entire ordeal. I plugged it into my laptop, hands shaking, expecting static or blank readings. But instead, there were coordinates, dozens of them plotted every few minutes over 4 days. What I saw made my blood run cold. The points zigzagged across miles of dense forest, some overlapping, others jumping miles apart within seconds. No logical pattern, no trail. Just chaos. But one thing stood out. Every entry labeled cabin location had different coordinates. Not one was repeated. Not once. I cross-checked the terrain. Most of those spots didn't even have clearings. No structure was ever found. The Ranger Division closed the case as equipment malfunction. But I know what I saw, and I know that thing still moves. I tried to forget. I deleted the files, burned the maps. But last week, the forestry drone pinged something strange. Same cabin, same slanted roof, sitting quiet in a new clearing 72 miles from where I'd last seen it. And this time, the door was open. Story 6. The Tunnel Under Widow's Ridge. I was deep into my 3rd year of geology studies when I got obsessed with the abandoned mining tunnels scattered around Widow's Ridge, a forgotten stretch of hills in northern Pennsylvania. What started as a paper on iron sedimentation turned into something else entirely after I stumbled across a reference to a blind shaft that had supposedly never been mapped. The original notes came from an 1890s mining journal stored in a backroom archive at the university, half-rotted, handwritten, and barely legible. I borrowed a GoPro, packed extra headlamps and rope, and drove out the following Saturday. The region was overgrown, the access road crumbling, and most of the marked shafts had long since collapsed or been sealed with rebar and concrete. But I wasn't looking for those. I found it just before dusk. A narrow hole tucked between mossy rocks behind a line of wind-stunted birch trees. No markers, no warning signs, but a blast of cool, stale air blew from its mouth, and that alone told me it went deep. I set anchor, clipped in, and started my descent. The walls were slick, the drop longer than expected. When I finally landed on firm ground, the temperature dropped sharply. I switched on my second light. There were footprints in the dust, not mine. Fresh, leading inward. The deeper I moved into the shaft, the more it stopped feeling like a mine and started feeling like something older. The support beams were crude, almost handmade, and the walls curved unnaturally, as if the rock had been softened and pushed apart rather than drilled. Then I saw the claw marks. Long, jagged grooves raked across the stone at shoulder height. They weren't made by any tool I knew, too uneven, too deep, as if something with immense strength had dragged its nails through solid rock. That's when I noticed the footprints again. Still fresh, still damp. But there were more now. Not just one set. Two. One smaller like a child's, the other heavier, barefoot, the toes long and oddly spaced. I stopped and listened. Nothing. Just the drip of a moisture far ahead and the weight of the earth pressing down. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed to leave. But curiosity overruled fear. I marked my path with chalk and kept moving deeper into the dark, following those prints into a silence that felt alive. I don't remember how long I was down there before I noticed the time was off. My watch said 3:42 p.m. But when I checked it again, after what felt like 20 minutes, it still said 3:42. I tapped the face, shook my wrist, nothing. I pulled out my phone. Dead. Full charge before the descent, now nothing. Even the backup battery showed 0. That was the first real moment I felt fear, not the prickling kind, but the kind that sinks its claws in. Then the singing started. Faint at first, like someone humming a lullaby just out of earshot. I froze, thinking maybe it was some kind of audio bleed from above, but I was hundreds of feet underground. There was no signal, no sound system. The tune was familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, an old Appalachian folk song I remembered from my grandmother's records. Something about a girl lost in the pines, her voice calling home through the hills. It echoed unnaturally in the tunnel, the melody weaving through stone like smoke. I turned off my headlamp, just for a moment. Pitch black, and yet I saw movement, shadows walking without light, just shapes. A child-sized figure ducking behind a beam, a taller one, lankier, waiting ahead. The song grew clearer, and it wasn't one voice now, it was two, singing in harmony, calling my name. I backed away slowly, heart pounding in my ears, trying to convince myself I was hallucinating from low oxygen or stress. The figures were gone again, if they were ever really there. But the song had stopped. And in its absence, the tunnel fell into a silence so thick, it felt like a physical thing pressing against my chest. That's when the ground shifted. It wasn't violent at first, just a deep creak, like a groan from the earth itself. I turned, and without warning, the ceiling collapsed behind me. Dust exploded into the air. Rock slammed down in a thunderous cascade. I threw myself forward as the tunnel choked itself shut. When the dust cleared, I was sealed in. Total darkness, total silence. Until I heard it. A whisper. Not from ahead, but behind the wall of debris. It was faint, raspy, and too high-pitched to be an adult. It spoke just one word, over and over. Bugsy. That was my childhood nickname, one I hadn't heard in 20 years. Something only my late sister used to call me. Bugsy, come on, come on, come on. I pressed my ear to the stone. The whisper grew louder, more urgent, more insistent. Then it started coming from in front of me too. Somehow, the voice was now on both sides. I was trapped between two whispering walls, both calling my name with the voice of the dead. They found me 2 days later, curled up near the collapsed tunnel mouth, dehydrated and barely conscious. I don't remember crawling back. I don't remember anything after the whispers. Just flashes. A flicker of candlelight. Fingers brushing my shoulder. The feeling of being watched from below. The rescue team said I was humming when they pulled me out. Not crying, not screaming, humming. At the hospital, my friends came to see me. But something in their faces changed when I spoke. "You okay, man?" one of them asked, forcing a smile. "Yeah," I answered. Or I thought I did. They exchanged a look. "Your voice, it's weird. Off." They couldn't explain it. Neither could I. I sounded the same in my head. But when they played a recording, it wasn't me. It was thinner, softer. It sounded like a child. And the pitch? It matched the voice that whispered my name in the dark. A month later, while still trying to make sense of what happened, I visited the local historical society. I asked about the Widow's Ridge tunnels and was handed an old mining journal from 1908. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but one entry froze my blood cold. It described a young man with a strange light on his forehead, mumbling old songs and answering to the name Bugsy. The entry went on to say he vanished into a newly dug tunnel minutes before a collapse killed 3 miners. The details matched everything: my appearance, the headlamp, the humming, even the nickname. But the journal was dated 117 years before I was born. The last line of the journal chilled me to my core. It read, "He carried a strange black sack with blinking red eyes that never closed." That was my backpack, LED charging lights and all. But if I wasn't there in 1908, how did they describe it so clearly? Story 7, Mile Marker 0. They say the desert can stretch time, that a long enough drive through dust and silence will peel your mind back to things you'd rather forget. Maybe that's why I took the job. I'd been a long-haul trucker for over 20 years. Nights on the road felt safer than nights in a house. I didn't sleep much anyway, not since the accident outside El Paso. A rollover, black ice, a rookie mistake that cost 2 lives. The guilt rode in the passenger seat every mile since. This new route came through a dispatch error. Some back road stretch between Nevada and Arizona I didn't recognize, flagged as mile marker 0 on the manifest. It was off any highway I knew. The route paid triple, though. Something about needing a seasoned driver who didn't ask questions. I pulled onto the road just before dusk. No signage, no GPS signal. Just faded pavement and 1,000 miles of red sand. The sun bled out behind the mesas as I passed the first painted marker, MM0. That's when the CB crackled. A voice came through, faint and gravelly. "You're early." I hadn't keyed the mic. I was driving alone. About 30 miles in, I saw him for the first time. A hitchhiker, standing dead still by the shoulder. Mid-40s, maybe older. Wore a faded army jacket and held a cardboard sign with no writing. I passed him doing 50 and he didn't move an inch. Didn't even raise his thumb. 10 miles later, saw him again. Same man, same spot, only now he was at mile marker 12. No vehicle in sight, no side roads. Just him and that blank cardboard sign. I gripped the wheel tighter. My eyes weren't playing tricks. I don't drink, I don't do pills, and I hadn't slept more than usual. But he was there. And then, at mile marker 19, he showed up again. 3rd time. Same dead stare. Same empty sign. But this time his head turned as I passed. Just slightly, enough to make my chest tighten. The CB crackled once more. "He's waiting for your answer?" The voice said low and close, like someone sitting in the bunk behind me. I pulled over and checked the back of the rig. Empty. Cold air rushed in. The desert was silent again. I climbed back into the cab and slammed the door, locking it without thinking. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. The hitchhiker wasn't just a trick of the desert. He was real, or at least something was real enough to keep showing up. I turned the CB off. I'd had enough of phantom voices. But 5 miles later, it switched itself back on. Static. Then a burst of white noise like a mic being fumbled. Then my voice. Not me now, me then. Dispatch, this is Unit 24 rollover on I-10 black ice trucks gone. Jesus, I think they're dead. It was the call I'd made after the crash in El Paso. The exact words. Word for word. My voice from 7 years ago broadcast back into the cab like it was happening in real time. I froze. Sweat pooled under my arms, despite the desert cold. I reached to turn the radio off again, but another voice cut in deeper, slower. Payment must equal weight. I stared at the mic. Its red light blinked like a heartbeat. Outside, the mile markers passed one by one. 30, 31, 32. And then, at mile marker 33, the hitchhiker was back standing in the middle of the road now. No longer holding the sign, just pointing at the sky with one hand, the other stretched toward me like he was offering something, or asking for it. I didn't stop, but I couldn't look away. I should have driven straight through, but the gas gauge dipped low near a mile marker 39, and a flickering neon sign promised a station just 2 miles ahead. I pulled off the highway, the engine humming low as I coasted into a desolate, dust-covered service stop. There was no attendant. Just an old pump and a cracked payphone hanging crooked off the wall. I filled the tank and climbed back in. That's when the sun blinked out for a split second, just like that. Like someone flicking a light switch, and when it came back, I was back at mile marker 0. Truck full, CB quiet. No memory of turning around. I checked the log. It was blank. No record of the last 100 miles. The clock on the dash had reset to 6:17 p.m., the same time I started this route. I drove again. This time I passed the hitchhiker at mile 6, then mile 12. He didn't look up. Just stood there, arms limp as if waiting. Again, the voice on the CB came back. My voice panicked and yelling about a jackknife trailer. A crash I hadn't remembered until that moment. Then snap, I was at mile marker 0 again. Each loop, something peeled away. The second time, I forgot my mother's maiden name. The third, I couldn't remember the face of the woman I loved in Tucson. On the fourth, I blanked on my own middle name. The loops weren't just resetting time, they were carving pieces out of me. By the fifth loop, I wasn't even sure what I was delivering anymore. Only that I hadn't paid in full. Not yet. When I finally stumbled out of the cab, dazed and dry-mouthed, the desert sun had shifted high overhead. My boots sank into hot sand as flashing lights approached. A Border Patrol SUV rolled up slow, and a young agent stepped out, hand resting near his belt. He asked for ID. I reached into my wallet, but my fingers trembled. I pulled out a license, weathered bent at the corners, photo faded. The agent studied it, then looked back at me, his brow creasing. "This expired in '92, he said flatly. I laughed, but it came out hollow. "That's impossible." "Sir," he said carefully, "where exactly did you come from?" I turned to point behind me toward the road, but there was no road. Just a long, empty stretch of sand and sun-baked rocks. No truck, no mile markers, nothing. He ran a check on the license anyway. The name matched. The address was a rest stop diner that had burned down decades ago. He radioed something in Spanish I couldn't follow and asked me to sit down in the shade. I asked him the date. When he answered, I didn't recognize the year. The Border Patrol agent returned with a strange look on his face. He handed me a printout from his onboard tablet. There was a fatal crash near mile marker 0, he said. Back in '92, tanker explosion. Driver died instantly. His name was yours. I stared at the screen. Same name, same photo, same eyes, just younger. The article mentioned no survivors, no remains worth identifying, only a scorched cab and a melted watch found beside the wreckage. My hand instinctively touched my wrist. No watch. The agent asked again if I needed help, but I didn't answer, because somewhere deep in my chest I felt it, that hollowed-out silence. The kind only the dead carry. I didn't argue when they let me go. I just walked back toward the desert. The road was waiting. It always is. I've been driving that stretch ever since, chasing exits that vanish, signs that lie. But no matter how far I go, I never get home. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.